2015, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton introduced House Resolution 158, which stated, resolved that the House of Representatives condemns the practice of untouchability and the discriminatory treatment of Dalits in South Asia and the Asian diaspora. As the Asian diaspora grew in Britain, the British Parliament considered adding caste to the characteristics protected by the Equality Act, but decided that case law should be used to address the issue. Case law showing that caste would be protected under the Equality Act's race and ethnic origin protections. The size of the South Asian population in the US is growing. According to the Census Bureau, nearly 5.4 million South Asians lived in the US in 2017, up from 2.5 million in 2010. Indians comprise the largest segment of the South Asian community, making up over 80% of the total population, followed by Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Nepalis, Sri Lankans, and Bhutanese. The state with the largest South Asian populations are California, New Jersey, Texas, and New York. While South Asian immigrants adapt to the US and abide by federal, state, and local laws, they also bring with them their culture. Consequently, in the US, most South Asians, regardless of religion, continue to believe in the caste system. Those of higher caste consciously or unconsciously discriminate on the basis of caste. Caste discrimination is practiced particularly in the workplace, but also in other locations where South Asians interact. Some of these practices are inconsistent with constitutional rights, laws, and regulations. Legislation, regulations, and jurisprudence need to adapt to the potential for increases in caste discrimination. In 2021, ICDR, as a member of a coalition of 14 organizations, submitted policy memos and legal arguments to the US EEOC and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice to recognize and enforce caste as a protected category under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Today, these presentations will identify areas of caste discrimination that require attention. Our first presenter, and I'm going to introduce each of them, is Kevin Brown, who will address Title VII recognizes caste as a protected category in employment. Kevin Brown is professor and holder of the Willoughby Chair at the University of South Carolina School of Law and the Richard S. Melvin Emeritus Professor of Indiana University Morris School of Law. He graduated from Yale Law School in 1982 and joined the Morris Law faculty in 1987. Professor Brown's research over the past 35 years has focused primarily on race discrimination in the US. However, for the past 2 decades, he's also focused on the relationship between Dalits and African Americans. He's the principal author of Does US Federal Employment Law Now Cover Caste Discrimination Based on Untouchability? If all else fails, there is the possible application of Bostock v. Clayton County, which is a forthcoming article in NYU Review of Law and Social Change. Next presenter will be Patrick Patterson, and he will address, will federal and state civil rights enforcement agencies recognize caste as a protected category? Patrick is a civil rights lawyer who served as senior counsel to the chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from 2010 to 2014, and as deputy director of the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs from 2014 to 2017. The next presenter will be Sunita Viswanath, who will address caste-based injustice and labor exploitation at places of worship. Sunita has worked for over 25 years in women's rights and human rights organizations. She co-founded Hindus for Human Rights in June 2019. In 2001, she co-founded the International Human Rights Organization, Women for Afghan Women, and served as board chair until January 2022. Sunita also founded Sadhana, the Coalition of Progressive Hindus, in 2011 in order to mobilize Hindu Americans to connect their faith to social justice and human rights. She serves on Sadhana's executive board. She received the White House Champion of Change Award under President Obama. Our last presenter is Ted Shaw, who will address immigration justice, caste-based discrimination, and harassment against racial minorities. He is the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and the director of the University of North Carolina Center for Civil Rights. His research areas include the 14th Amendment, affirmative action, housing policies regarding fair housing. Professor Shaw attended Columbia University Law School as a Charles Evans Hughes Fellow. He then practiced as a trial attorney in the honors program of the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. In 1982, he joined the staff of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He worked for over 6 years there, including litigating cases related to elementary, secondary, and higher education, housing, voting rights, and capital punishment. So for this panel, each presenter will speak for up to 7 minutes, and then we're going to follow all of the presentations by a Q&A. So Professor Brown, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rick. I will briefly address the issues regarding whether caste discrimination is a form of discrimination recognized under Title VII. My arguments will primarily come from the law review article that Rick has just mentioned. Besides myself, the authors include the top legal expert in the UK on caste discrimination, one of the few Dalits to have obtained a PhD from an American university, and Ted Shaw, who is a former director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. We firmly believe that there are very strong legal arguments that caste discrimination based on untouchability is included under the protected Title VII traits of religion, national origin, and race. While we don't think it's necessary, we also believe that the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock versus Clayton County, decided in June of 2020, provides an additional legal argument for the view that Title VII prohibits caste discrimination based on untouchability. With respect to religious discrimination, several courts have recognized the validity of religious non-adherence discrimination claims, also known as reverse religious discrimination claims. In a religious non-adherence claim, an employee argues that their employer discriminated against them because the employee did not share the religious beliefs of the employer. The focus of religious non-adherence claims is on the discriminator's beliefs. Thus, a Dalit victim of caste discrimination based on untouchability may be able to establish a question of tribal fact. Effectively, what the Dalit victim would assert is that by not following the discriminator's religious beliefs, the Dalit should act and behave in certain ways due to the Dalit's caste. They're refusing to share the perpetrator's religious beliefs. With regard to national origin discrimination, Title VII does not define national origin. However, each year, certain employers subject to Title VII are required to submit EEO-1 reports. In filing these reports, employers must use the race and ethnic categories provided by the federal government that were first agreed upon in 1977. Under those definitions, caste is not considered an ethnicity or race. However, those definitions were enacted 13 years after Title VII, and more importantly, federal courts have not used them to determine what race or ethnicity is under Title VII. In a 1973 decision, the Supreme Court noted that an earlier version of Section 703 had included ancestry as a protected trait, but it was removed. The removal was not supposed to be a material change, but was rather considered to be synonymous with national origin. The EEOC's guidance on discrimination based on national origin also focuses on an individual's physical, cultural, or linguistic characteristics. Given these definitions, Dalits could be considered a national origin group under the following arguments. While physical and linguistic characteristics may not differentiate Dalits from other South Asians, their hereditary membership in a group presumed by discriminators to be religiously polluted could constitute a cultural group. They could also be considered a national origin based upon their ancestry. This was the path a UK court took in applying their Equality Act to a case of caste discrimination, as Rick has already mentioned. With respect to race discrimination, Title VII does not define the term race, and the EEOC has not done so either. Courts, too, are uncertain about its definition. As the Second Circuit stated in a 2003 case, claims based on race and national origin may substantially overlap or even be indistinguishable depending on the specific facts of the case. Section 1981, originally enacted as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, is the historical predecessor of Title VII. Courts often analyze intentional employment discrimination claims involving race and national origin under the two statutes in a very similar, if not identical, way. Indeed, as the Second Circuit put it, we analyze claims of racial discrimination identically under Title VII and Section 1981. In a 1987 case, the Supreme Court stated that the definition of race for 1981 was then to be drawn from how it was understood in the 19th century. In its review of contemporary sources, the court listed several races from those sources, including Finns, Romanized, Swedes, Germans, Mongolians, and Jews. The inclusion of the Romanized is significant because they are believed to be Dalits who migrated into Eastern Europe. But at any rate, abolitionists started to analogize the treatment of African Americans to the caste system as early as the 1830s. Perhaps the most significant legal effort to employ the caste analogy to the treatment of Black people in the North during the antebellum period occurred in the attacks on school segregation in Boston, which culminated in 1849 in the decision by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in Roberts, Boston. And as Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal pointed out in The American Dilemma, the use of the term caste to refer to the status of Blacks increased significantly in the 1860s. During debates of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, several congressmen analogized the treatment of African Americans to the caste system. And of course, every American lawyer is familiar with Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, where he states, "There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind." In other words, in the very creation of federal anti-discrimination law was the idea that the treatment of Black people was like the caste in India. And if they saw race discrimination in the US as analogous to discrimination generated by the caste system, then it's logical to assume that they saw caste discrimination as a form of race discrimination. When Congress debated the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there were some references to caste, but they were not nearly as numerous as what existed during the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Finally, while we believe that caste discrimination is a form of religious, national origin, or race discrimination under Title VII, if all else fails, there is the approach the Supreme Court used in the 2020 case of Bostock versus Clayton County. This argument tracks the Supreme Court's approach used in Bostock to address the discriminatory treatment experienced by gays, lesbians, or transgendered individuals from their employers. While Justice Gorsuch applied the but-for test, he noted that a but-for test directs us to change one thing at a time to see if the outcome changes. If it does, we have a but-for cause, and there can be multiple but-for causes. Gorsuch goes on to note that while a person's sex is distinct from their status as a gay, lesbian, or transgendered person, their status is inextricably intertwined with their sex. To illustrate, take an employer who has two employees that are attracted to men. One is a woman, the other is a man. If the employer would fire the man but not the woman, Then the employer's decision to fire the male employee reveals that the employer is firing the male employee for actions that the employer tolerates in female employees. The same logic applies to transgendered individuals. Thus, sex is one of the but-for causes of the adverse employment action. Now, since all those who are victims of caste discrimination based on untouchability are from Asian countries, all Dalits are Asians. Thus, being a Dalit is inextricably intertwined with being Asian. Applying the Bostock approach means if we change the race of a particular Dalit victimized by caste discrimination from Asian to, say, Black or white, then the person would no longer be a Dalit. For employers whose adverse employment action is motivated by a desire to engage in caste discrimination, changing the person's race would lead to a different decision, simply because the person would no longer be a Dalit. Thus, caste discrimination based on untouchability is included within the protected trait of race discrimination under Title VII. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. Rick?
And thank you so much. Our next speaker is Patrick Patterson, who will talk about will federal and state civil rights enforcement agencies recognize caste as a protected category. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rick. As Rick just stated, my presentation is in the form of a question. Will federal and state civil rights agencies recognize caste as a protected category? And I can tell you right away, my answer is I don't know. Kevin talked about many of the arguments that can be used to interpret Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to encompass caste discrimination, but we don't know if any of the federal agencies are going to adopt that approach. Title VII is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Justice. And in addition to that, we need to think about Executive Order 11246, which is enforced by the Department of Labor and its agency, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. That executive order prohibits discrimination by federal contractors, contractors with the federal government. Title VII applies to a broad range of employers, private and public. Both of those sources of law prohibit discrimination and harassment because of race, color, national origin, and religion, but they don't say the word caste, which is why Kevin was spending time trying to discuss the arguments that could be made to have those categories cover caste. The agencies, and I'll start with the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, have not taken a position on that issue. There are a few references in some EEOC materials that can be used to make the argument that caste can be covered. Kevin discussed one of them in the national origin guidance of EEOC. There's also the EEOC compliance manual. Section 15 of that manual states that race is not defined in Title VII, but EEOC says the racial categories used by the Office of Management and Budget are, quote, social political constructs and should not be interpreted as being genetic, biological, or anthropological in nature. That can be used to argue that caste could be covered. The EEOC compliance manual also recognizes that race may overlap with other categories. And it says, quote, for example, a discrimination complaint by an Asian Indian can implicate race, color, and national origin. Again, echoing one of the arguments Kevin was making. The compliance manual goes on to state that race generally encompasses ancestry, which Kevin also mentioned as coming up in the interpretation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and minimally, at least in the debates about the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64. Ancestry, the EEOC says in its compliance manual, is, quote, discrimination against a person because of his or her ancestry can violate Title VII's prohibition of race discrimination. So the EEOC has gone as far as to say that ancestry discrimination can constitute race discrimination. It has not explicitly tied that to caste. The manual also states that, quote, Title VII prohibits employment discrimination against a person because of cultural characteristics, often linked to race or ethnicity, such as a person's name, cultural dress, and grooming practices or accent or manner of speech. Again, something that could be used to argue that caste could be covered. Turning to the Department of Labor briefly, I'm not aware of anything in any of their guidances or regulations that addresses the issue of caste. As Rick mentioned, there was a meeting with all these agencies last year, and presentations were made to them. I'm not aware of any action those agencies have taken since, but they at least have been made aware of the issue and could be considering it. I would also say that I'm not aware of any federal court decisions that are definitive on whether caste discrimination is covered by Title VII or the executive order. So that's what I can say about federal law. I'd like to turn briefly to the question of state laws. Unlike Title VII and the executive order, California and some other state laws expressly prohibit discrimination based on ancestry. In addition to those other categories, race, national origin, religion, they also specifically cover ancestry. And it may be that it's more likely to be able to persuade agencies and courts to cover caste under this category, remains to be seen. But there are some developments beginning to happen in state courts and agencies that suggest that might be possible. I'd like to bring your attention to one particular case, California Department of Fair Employment and Housing versus Cisco Systems. And the most recent decision in this case was just a few weeks ago on August 5th by the California Court of Appeal. In this case, in 2020, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, or DFEH, which recently changed its name to California Civil Rights Department, it filed a lawsuit in state court alleging that Cisco and two upper caste managers of Indian descent had discriminated against a Dalit employee, also of Indian descent, of course, because of his caste. The suit by the DFEH alleged race, color, national origin, religion, and ancestry discrimination. So it covered all those categories. And it alleged discrimination, harassment, and retaliation in violation of the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. The DFEH alleged in its complaint that Cisco is a major tech company with more than 18,000 employees in California. The great majority of Indian immigrants to the US, more than 98% according to the complaint, are upper caste, and it said the same is true of the Cisco workforce. Cisco, and it said, quote, Cisco has employed a predominantly South Asian Indian workforce for decades. The employee who initiated this case worked in a team composed entirely of Indian employees who grew up in India and immigrated as adults to the US. Other than the employee, the complaint alleged, the entire team were upper caste Indians, and they, quote, imported the discriminatory caste systems practices into their team and into Cisco's workplace. The complaint then goes on to allege that because of his caste, the employee received the lowest status job assignments within the team and was isolated from other members of the team. He received less pay, fewer opportunities, and other inferior terms and conditions of employment, including denial of raises and promotions. He was subjected to a hostile work environment. He was subjected to retaliation when he complained to a supervisor and to HR, including the denial of raises and promotions. The complaint also alleges that Cisco failed to take reasonable steps to prevent and correct the violations, and instead maintained that discrimination and harassment because of caste were not illegal. That was Cisco's position when he complained. That case has not yet gotten to the point at which any court must determine whether caste-based discrimination is prohibited by California law. However, a decision in the case that I just mentioned a few weeks ago by the California Court of Appeal does point in that direction. The trial court in this case denied a motion that DFEH filed for an order allowing the litigation to proceed using a fictitious name for the employee, so calling him John Doe. And that was the employee who had filed the administrative complaint that resulted in DFEH's investigation of his claim and then DFEH's lawsuit that it filed. But that employee is not an actual party to the lawsuit himself. So the trial court refused to grant DFEH the ability to proceed using that fictitious name, DFEH asked the appellate court to review that decision. And in the trial court, the DFEH submitted evidence that revealing the employee's name, and therefore likely his caste, could lead not only to further discrimination, harassment, and retaliation directed at him and his family in the US, but also to mistreatment and even physical danger to his family members who still lived in India. The trial court refused to consider the risk of harm. It expressly refused to consider the risk of harm to family members living outside the US and denied the motion. So it ruled that the DFEH had to use the employee's real name in the lawsuit. The Court of Appeal in this ruling just a few weeks ago rejected that decision by the trial court and held that the risk of harm to family members in another country is a relevant factor that the trial court must consider. And so it sent the case back to the trial court with instructions to reconsider its previous decision. So as I said, the Court of Appeal did not rule on the question of whether the California law prohibits caste-based discrimination, but it did recognize the existence of such discrimination and the harms that can result from it. Further litigation may directly establish that the California law prohibits that kind of discrimination, maybe as a form of ancestry discrimination or one or more of the other categories. But Cisco, the Cisco case is a step in the direction of finding that at least one state's law prohibits caste-based discrimination. And that could happen, that case could get to this point only because John Doe, as the case calls him, filed a complaint with the state agency in the first place. He filed with both the state agency and the EEOC, as a matter of fact. Cisco is likely to appeal this decision to the California Supreme Court, which may further clarify the law on this point. It's important for individuals who experience caste-based discrimination in the workplace to file these complaints so that the agencies, federal, state, and local agencies can investigate them. And that's the only way the law is going to develop that will provide protection directly against such discrimination. Procedures for filing those complaints are set forth in the agency websites. EEOC.gov is one, calcivilrights.ca.gov is another. You can go to those websites and find out exactly how to file complaints and how those cases work in the administrative level. But I'd urge people to do that so that the law can further develop along these lines. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Rick.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Our next speaker is Sunita Viswanath. She'll be talking about caste-based injustice and labor exploitation at places of worship. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. My name is Sunita Viswanath, and I serve as Executive Director of Hindus for Human Rights. We in Hindus for Human Rights advocate for pluralism, civil and human rights in South Asia and North America. We are rooted in the values of our faith, Shanti, that's peace, Nyaya, justice, and Satya, truth. We provide a Hindu voice of resistance to caste, Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, racism, and all forms of bigotry and oppression. And I'm honored to be speaking here alongside many distinguished speakers. Caste discrimination takes place in many facets of South Asian American life: housing, education, workplaces. A survey from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace found that caste affiliation doesn't disappear with time. Hindu Indian Americans who recently arrived in the United States are just as likely to identify with a caste group as those who have been here for 25 years or more. Also, 21% of the respondents said that among their Indian friends, most or all of their friends are from the same caste. But I'm here to talk specifically about how caste-based labor exploitation shows up in another facet of South Asian American life: places of worship. In May 2021, the New York Times reported that the BAP's Sri Swaminarayan Mandir in Robbinsville, New Jersey, was using exploited Dalit and Adivasi, that's indigenous, labor for temple renovations. This news sent shockwaves throughout our community. This wasn't the first case of caste-based discrimination or labor exploitation in the US. More than 20 years ago, in 2001, a landlord in Berkeley, California, was convicted of trafficking young Indian girls and women, most of whom were Dalit, for sex and slavery. However, the BAPS case was the largest such case by far. A few months later, this case was expanded to cover hundreds of workers at BAPS temples across the United States, in Atlanta, Chicago, Houston, and Los Angeles, making this potentially one of the largest forced labor cases in US history. In response, we at Hindus for Human Rights partnered with ICDR to investigate this phenomenon of caste-based labor exploitation at houses of worship. In June 2022, we published our report, Built by Injustice, South Asian Migrant Worker Exploitation at Places of Worship. And perhaps somebody could put the report in the chat. In our report, we examined cases of labor exploitation across the South Asia and South Asian diaspora, Hindu temples in Canada and the United Kingdom, a Sikh Gurudwara in New Zealand, and the sandstone mining industry in Rajasthan, India, which supplies materials for BAPS temples and other temples as well all around the world. Our investigation uncovered a number of troubling dynamics that allowed labor exploitation to take place. Firstly, most places of worship we investigated did not engage in transparent recruitment processes. Many of the exploited workers were from marginalized groups within Indian society, suggesting that the undisclosed nature of the recruitment process provides an ongoing opportunity for exploitation. In the cases we explored, workers were often unaware that they were being recruited on false promises. There's a need for increased transparency to prevent exploitation of vulnerable individuals and groups. Additionally, in the cases we looked at, workers were not treated by their overseers as official employees or contractors in accordance with applicable labor laws. Migrant workers were also often unaware of the labor, health, and safety laws in the countries where they were working. They also didn't know how to safely and effectively raise their concerns, given that they were in a foreign country. Language barriers also played a role in migrant workers not being able to access legal services or mechanisms to obtain justice. Based on our findings, we developed a number of policy recommendations for the US federal government. These recommendations can avoid creating these kinds of exploitative environments in the future, like those of the BAPS temples I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. These recommendations can also help reconcile and repair the damage that has already been done. 1, federal government agencies should engage civil society organizations to better understand signs of caste-based exploitation and the loopholes that enable this exploitation during the recruitment of workers, the immigrant process, and at work sites. 2, the federal government should integrate awareness of caste discrimination and other forms of exploitation during immigration application reviews and on-site inspections. 3, relevant government agencies should conduct periodic inspections of places of worship which are hosting migrant workers. This would be to ensure that relevant immigration, labor, and health and safety laws are being followed and to engage directly with workers. 4, the Department of Homeland Security and State Department entities should provide sufficient South Asian language resources, especially for US citizenship and immigration services and at US consulates in South Asia. And 5, finally, the federal government should create and mandate caste sensitivity trainings for government workers in order to improve their understanding of power dynamics and casteism. The magnitude of the ongoing BAPS case should be a clear sign to all of us that caste-based exploitation isn't just a foreign issue, it's an American issue. For those of us watching from the Departments of Justice, Labor, and State, as well as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We want to support you in ensuring that caste-based exploitation at houses of worship and in all aspects of American life no longer be acceptable. And as Hindu human rights, we will continue mobilizing more Hindu Americans to speak up against caste and all the ways it manifests itself in our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sunita. That was great. Our next speaker will be Ted Shaw, who will address immigration justice, caste-based discrimination, and harassment against racial minorities. Go ahead, Ted, and make sure you're unmuted.
Thank you. I think I'm unmuted. So it's an honor to be here with you today. I want to say a few words in a little bit of time that I'm allotted about immigration issues. And I want to give some background on the presence of both Dalits, but also the larger grouping of people from Southeast Asia and United States. Some of these statistics, when I became aware of them, were surprising to me. And so I want to highlight some of them. First, the presence of people from India and from Southeast Asia, for that matter, the United States, has had some remarkable trends. So it may not be so apparent, but in the early part of the 20th century, there were in the United States a number of people from Southeast Asia that were striking. But what we saw after World War II was a dip and then eventually a rise in the number of people from India and Southeast Asia. A little bit more detailed about that. So in the 1920s, of course, there were quite a few changes in immigration law in the United States. Most of us are aware of some of this history in the United States during that era. But there was a great deal of discrimination against people of color. In the 1920s, there were limitations on immigration into the United States. And of course, during the World War II period, there was a lot of discrimination against people of color, both here in the United States, but also there was discrimination against immigrants in the United States. So, of course, the difficult issue in understanding of how this applies to Dalits is the question of the extent to which Dalits represent a portion of and how large a portion of immigrants from Asia in the United States. South Asians rather didn't migrate to the United States in large numbers until the mid-19th century. What we saw during this period of 1920, fewer than 5,000 Indians residing in the United States. What's striking in part is that after World War II, or rather before the beginning of World War II, as late as 1940, there were only 2,400 Southeast Asians in the United States. And what's striking about that is that's South Asians. That's not just Indians. It's South Asians generally, which means there was an even greater dip during that period among Indians in the United States. After World War II, however, we saw eventually some increases of Indian immigration in the United States, but even as late as 1960, the number of Indians in the United States was surprisingly, at least in my view, surprisingly modest. So in 1960, fewer than 13,000 people of Indian origin living in the United States. In 65, there was further legislation with respect to immigration that was aimed at non-discrimination. But fast forward to 2019, 2.7 million Indian immigrants in the country, up from 450,000 in 1990. That's an extraordinary increase in the number of Indians. Some of this is a consequence of the Y2K phenomenon, when many Indians who were very much ingrained in the high-tech industry came to the United States, and there was a very important increase in Indian population. It was a catalyst for people from South East Asia in general, but for Indians in particular, very few of them Dalits. Let me digress to make a quick point about which we should be aware. Discrimination on the basis of or against Dalits is by definition class-based discrimination, given what it means to be designated as a Dalit. In this country, in the United States, there are not protections against discrimination on the basis of economic status or poverty. See San Antonio versus Rodriguez, a 1973 case in which the Supreme Court rejected the notion that economic status was a suspect classification under the 14th Amendment. But in general, we don't see protection against discrimination on the basis of economic status. And so that is something to keep in mind when we talk about whether or not discrimination against Dalits, which is a form of discrimination that's class discrimination, is protected against in this country. On the other hand, if being a Dalit is a racial phenomenon, then of course we have Section 1981 coming into play, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, on the basis of national origin, we have Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act coming into play. And so I wanted to underscore those things. Title VII doesn't define national origin on the face of the statute. See Espinoza versus Farrar Manufacturing Company. But nonetheless, discrimination on the basis of national origin is prohibited under Title VII. Let me just try to wrap this up by then turning to the question of whether discrimination on the basis of one being a Dalit falls into the phenomenon of harassment in the United States. In recent years, and I want to point particularly to the post 9/11 phenomenon, when there was a lot of hostility toward people, not only from the Middle East, but also the failure of many Americans who engaged in discriminatory conduct and harassment, the failure to distinguish or have the ability to exhibit the ability to distinguish between people from Southeast Asia, including from India, and people were from the Middle East, which on its face seems to some of us to be somewhat absurd. But there was a rise in discrimination against people of color in particular, but people from Southeast Asia and people from the Middle East in general. That phenomenon has led to increased hostility against people from India. And one of the things that's interesting about that phenomenon is that within, of course, Indian communities, Dalits are discriminated against, and so they are included in that discrimination by white Americans, but they also have the double discrimination of being part of the Dalit community within Indian communities. Let me close this out by saying that the presence of people originating in India as immigrants in the United States, as I indicated, has grown phenomenally. And while that presence raises issues of the standing of people from India, because there is violence, there is harassment against Indians here in the United States. The discrimination against Dalits is not something that gets enough attention, in addition to the discrimination against people from Southeast Asia and India in general. It's our hope that the federal agencies will, of course, move to provide more protection and apply anti-discrimination laws, including Title VII, including Section 1981, to protect against discrimination in areas of employment. But we also urge and hope and push the federal government, the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, to pay particular attention to discrimination against Dalits and people from Southeast Asia in general, particularly in this time and era when discrimination on the basis of race as a general matter has seen a resurgence. And we believe that the questions of race and national origin have particular resonance when it comes to people from Southeast Asia, but especially from Dalits. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Shaw. We're open for about 20 minutes of Q&A. And if you know how to do it, please raise your hand electronically. If you cannot do that, please enter your questions into the chat. And thanks to our entire panel. Dinesh, go ahead, please unmute.
All right, yeah, I'm unmuted, I think.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for great presentations. Very informative. I mean, there is still not much awareness about caste. Just to clarify, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and I'm involved in DEI efforts here. So I have two questions, which I mean, kind of goes directly to the presentations that you have provided. One, there is not much awareness about what caste is. at the grassroots level, and even at the, I have seen here at the University of Michigan also, like even at the leadership level, they're not aware of what's going on with the caste, whereas, it goes directly to DEI. Now, a good starting point to spread more awareness could be the schools and the institutes of higher education, which has been kind of happening, at different universities have started use or have incorporated caste as a protected category in their language, non-discriminatory language. So do you think it would be impactful, or can you comment on like how much you see the impact of it? So that's the first question. The second one is, there has been some pushback from some Hindu groups for bringing caste into limelight. Like they don't want the caste to be raised, like the issues surrounding the caste, saying that it somehow maligns the Hindu religion. Now, there is some merit to it because it's not only the Hindus who practice caste, the other religions also. So do you think there is some value in delinking caste from religion, making it a secular problem that cuts across religions, be it Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, Muslims? So those are the two questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, who on the panel would like to address question one?
Let me at least address that issue of thinking of caste from religion, and then I also want to also make another quick point about, you're right, the lack of knowledge about caste. But with respect to the delinking, right, the legal question here is whether or not caste discrimination is going on. It's not whether or not Hindus are discriminating, Buddhists discriminate, Sikhs discriminate. It's about caste. So it's not about religion at all. In other words, from a legal standpoint, there is a delinking between the concept of caste and the concept of religion. Now, if in fact you do find an argument that we're talking about religious discrimination, where we're talking about the Dalit is arguing they don't share the religion of the discriminator, that aspect would be religious. But the race and ethnicity part would not be religion at all. Then with respect to the notion of the knowledge about caste, I think you're right. There's not a lot of knowledge in the US about caste, primarily because, and it certainly was pointed out by Ted Shaw, the number of South Asians in the US has been historically very small. Dalits among the number of South Asians has been almost infinitesimal. The difference in the US, though, is that the US has a long history of analogizing the discrimination of Blacks in the US to the caste system in South Asia. So that there's a connection here between race and caste that doesn't really exist in any other countries. And that linking of caste and race, or at least caste and the treatment of Black people in the US, goes all the way back to the 1830s. So from a legal standpoint, there's almost a 200-year history, although you're right to say within the general population, there's not a great deal of knowledge about the caste system.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Great. Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to Dinesh's questions?
Just going briefly to the first question about universities recognizing caste as a protected category. That is happening. It's correct at some universities around the country, and I think that's an important development. And I believe it's important to support that and to get more universities to take that position, because that contributes to the overall movement toward protecting caste as a category that should be, for which discrimination should be prohibited. So I believe that should be done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a question from the chat from Ravi Kumar. Is the issue not caste, but caste discrimination? And just
Yes.
Go ahead, Professor Brown.
Yes. I don't know how much more to say.
Well, as the moderator, I'd say that caste discrimination is something that we should be concerned about in terms of government relations with people. Caste in general is something that we should be all concerned about, regardless of government action. We have a hand up from someone who has my name, Rick Gold. Could you speak up and give us your name?
Yeah, Sam Ilangovan. I don't know how I got your name.
That's okay.
There is a movement now, and in Illinois and New Jersey, it has become a law that education starts.
Could you get closer to the microphone where we don't hear you that well?
In Illinois and New Jersey, it has been brought that Asian history should be taught to school children. There, we should incorporate the caste as a evil thing and should be eliminated altogether, and caste discrimination, the effect and all that, should become a part of the educational process. Can we do anything about that? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to address that?
Well, I would like to have somebody reframe it because I still lost some of it, even though the latter part of it was clearer. So would somebody reframe it or repeat it?
Thank you. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. In state of Illinois and New Jersey, recently it has been brought up that Asian history should be taught in school. There, caste should become a prominent thing, as an evil thing, and should not be practiced. That should be part of the educational curriculum. That's what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So Ted, could you address that?
Well, I certainly would agree that I would like to see the issues taught and raised up. Of course, in the United States right now, in many of the states, places like Florida and other jurisdictions, teaching both on the elementary and secondary level, sometimes even beyond that, teaching anything that allegedly makes people feel uncomfortable that is related to issues of race, but I think it might extend also to the kinds of issues we're talking about. There's a strong movement against all that. The irony in lifting up caste again in this country is that we don't deal enough in this country with issues of economic status inequality, discrimination, etc. So I'd like to see it done, generally speaking, but also to the extent that there's an imported, if I may, issue with respect to caste discrimination against Dalits. Certainly, I would like to see that issue raised up and educational issues and spotlighted, highlighted.
Thank you so much. Ravi, you want to speak again?
No, thank you for that, Rick. I was just going to elaborate on the point that I made, which was around whether caste is the issue or caste discrimination. Here in the UK, we've been lobbying for legislation to protect victims of caste discrimination. And one of the issues we've had is when you liaise and talk with the communities that are affected, many often say, well, look, caste is my heritage. And if I want to marry within my caste, that's my choice. Who are you to stop me, really? And so one of the things that shaped us was we were focused on the discrimination part. And so I was interested in one of the comments made earlier about banning matrimonials, and we did have some resistance to that. But there was some news 2 years ago where we found one of the main matrimonial sites here in the UK and worldwide, actually, shoddy.com. I'll post a link in the chat about it. It was discovered that their algorithm was being biased towards Dalits and so-called lower castes, where they were not being given suitable matches from the so-called upper castes as well. It's always something we found quite problematic, really, is that when people feel pride around their heritage and their caste, but associated with that is the discrimination part. Some of the popular music glorifies certain castes, even though they may not be talking bad about other castes. They're promoting themselves up, which ultimately is promoting a caste consciousness, which is then ultimately leads to caste discrimination. So it's a tough one, but that's why I thought I'd mention it now, that the discrimination is the issue that we're trying to target.
Excellent. Thank you very much for elaborating.
I want you, because I think that's right. I think in the US, there's very much the sense that there is a personal sphere and that an individual can in fact engage in discrimination within that personal sphere. But there's some things that we think of as more public, and certainly employment, housing, owning a shop, businesses, obviously all of government is that way. Now, can you really root out race discrimination without also going into that private sphere? And I would say probably, if so, it's going to take a very, very long time. But the structure of American law, I think, won't allow you to go that far, right? We're not going to go so far as to say you can't discriminate when it comes to marriage. And even if we did, how would you ever enforce it? So I understand the argument that if you don't go all the way, caste discrimination will stay for a very long time. But I think there are limits, at least in the US, on how far we would be willing to go from a legal standpoint. And I suspect it's the same with the UK.
Thank you, Professor Brown. Mina, go ahead.
Actually, it's a good point to follow up on. I'm Mina Varma. I'm the Executive Director of the International Dalit Solidarity Network. And I've been working alongside Ravi Kumar and others on the caste legislation in the UK. And that point Kevin just made is absolutely right. The legislation in the UK within the Equality Act, which is still sitting there silently, actually does focus on the public. It's about public goods, provision of public goods and services, discrimination in employment, discrimination in education. We cannot, that cannot be applied to the private sphere, no matter how heinous that may well be. So the legislation is very focused on that public sphere. But I mean, there's lots of things I agree with in the chat as well. And I think what Ravi just said about caste and caste discrimination, it's difficult. And I think Raju has also said about how you separate that. So you can't, I mean, ending caste discrimination has to at some point start with legislation. Caste discrimination, which has existed, and the caste system, which has existed for millennia, is not going to disappear overnight. But what we have to focus on is legislation and standards that will change behavior. Because if behavior starts to change, then over time, mindsets will change in exactly the same way there has been a shift for race discrimination and sex discrimination and now transgender discrimination. We have to really make that behavioral change, because that's the only way we can then push. Because if you have a consequence for your behavior, then your behavior has to change. And I think, you know, the other thing around caste and caste discrimination, caste exists, it has to go, because it's the caste that causes the discrimination. But let's focus on getting anti-discrimination laws and stuff out there first.
Great comments. Thank you so much, Mina. We have will be the last question from Jeremy Rinker, and I'm just going to read it. Would love to hear speakers' thoughts on the growing use of terminology of racial caste we're hearing in public discourse in the US, especially after Michelle Alexander and Isabel Wilkerson's books. Is this a positive shift in discourse? And will it help educate people about caste? I'm hearing about it more often, but not sure that it brings clarity or educates.
see here. Well, I'll certainly take a crack at this too. Yeah, that's an interesting move. Race discrimination has this real negative connotation in the United States. I mean, to say someone's engaged in race discrimination is seen as a real insult, right? We've even seen Donald Trump go, "I'm the least racist person you've ever met," right? And then everybody else goes, "Well, come on, Donald, let's be for real." So to the extent that one can tie the concept of caste discrimination to race, you can pull on that American rejection of race discrimination, and it may make it a more powerful move because caste discrimination is something that Americans, generally speaking, don't understand. But then separate from that, I do want to say, right, American society does have a very long history of thinking about race discrimination in terms of caste discrimination. Ted is there. He's part of a group of scholars like me who have been arguing for decades that America's Equal Protection Clause should be an anti-caste measure. Not that it is, but it should be. So in a way, making that argument of racial caste in the US is going to have resonance that it's not going to have other places in the world.
Thank you.
But
Other comments? Go ahead, Ted.
If I can add something to this, the thing that whether it's Michelle Alexander or Isabel Wilkerson or others, the thing that their use of the word caste, I think, brings to the discourse about race is that caste is understood, I think, even though most Americans don't really understand caste as it originates from and in India and Southeast Asia. But there's an understanding of the term caste generally as something that is rigid. And most Americans, I think, if you ask them about caste, would say that it is not only rigid, but it's unfair. It's something that people are born into, and they can't move up or down in their status in society. Well, there's a lot to be said about thinking about the American experience of race and asking ourselves how much that is also its own caste system in the United States. And that, I think, is useful. But as I indicated before, in this country right now, any discourse that makes people feel, quote, uncomfortable is being targeted as inappropriate. And certainly in the educational sphere, there's a movement among right-wingers and conservatives to push those discussions out of educational institutions. And to that extent, I think caste will be treated very much like race in the United States.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to add one more question from the chat. This is from Sonia Paul. Could anyone comment on the relationship between caste and mental health? I'm wondering about caste anxiety and nerves around being outed among Dalits, and how that could perhaps be an indicator of the potential for discrimination, if not actual discrimination.
Well, my response is not actually directly about mental health issues, but I want to remind the participants here that I did talk about a case where a Dalit individual who filed a complaint was afraid of having his name and his identity and his caste revealed. And I think that is a clear indication of the difficulties that can be faced by people when they come forward with these cases. And that's why it's difficult for many people to do it. but it's important to recognize that there are at least some protections in the law to try to protect their identity and protect them from that kind of retaliation and harassment that the person was afraid of in the case I mentioned. And that was in California, and the California agency took steps to protect his identity. EEOC also has that authority under its regulations to protect identity of people in that kind of situation when they litigate cases. So again, not directly addressing the mental health question, but addressing that there are some protections for people who come forward because they are afraid of exactly that kind of problem.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So to sum up, we've had an absolutely fascinating panel discussion on the increasing issues of caste discrimination and the increasing interest of federal and state officials in trying to put in place a legal framework and administrative framework to address caste discrimination. This is an issue for Congress, and this is why we at ICDR have initiated a series of discussions focusing on caste discrimination for congressional staffers and representatives and senators, something that needs to be watched because the issue of caste discrimination is becoming much more important in American society. So thank you all for attending. We have recorded this session, and I hope that we'll be able to share that with you very shortly. Thanks very much.
Thank you.